When I first had to install NSX, the whole idea of it was very daunting. And installing NSX is a challenge, and it's a different challenge depending on whether we are doing a greenfield deployment or a brownfield deployment. Greenfield deployment simply referred to a vSphere infrastructure that is being built at the same time as NSX. And it really makes our job easier because we can just focus on initially building an infrastructure to support NSX. We're not building any components that aren't there for the purpose of a virtualized network. But in a brownfield deployment, you've already rolled out vSphere to support standard networking with standard or distributed switches that interconnect with your physical switches in the normal way. There's no VXLAN encapsulation. It's just packets going off to the switch like anything else. And so a brownfield deployment takes a little bit more consideration because there's going to have to be a migration process with an overarching goal of ensuring that we don't break things as we migrate. So in this nugget, we're just going to tackle that core issue. Is my environment ready for NSX? So in looking at the idea of being ready for a deployment of NSX, there's a couple of things we have to consider. A lot of our preparation is going to go into the ESXi hosts and into the vCenter server and the existing elements of the physical network to ensure that we have the connectivity we need. That way, when we add all these NSX elements, everything just works the way it's supposed to. As we look to integrate NSX Manager and the vCenter server together, we're going to need to have some minimum permissions, like being a member of the administrators group in the single sign-on service of vCenter server. And NSX creates quite a few virtual machines in the process of supporting network virtualization. Control VMs, cluster VMs, edge VMs, which means we need to have permissions to create the VMs on the various different clusters where they reside. Inside of vSphere, we should already have our infrastructure in place with regard to a management cluster of ESXi hosts, an edge cluster, if we want one, and our compute clusters. In a greenfield deployment, that's going to be building them from scratch. In a brownfield deployment, we have to ask ourselves questions about how we're going to define those, create the connective tissue, if we're going to aggregate management and the edge together or keep those apart. And all of these need to have their IPv4 and or IPv6 topology in place, which means not only known IP addresses for connecting our devices together, but also DNS support and NTP support for consistency. Now, as we look at crossing the boundary between the logical network and the physical network, a couple of key things to keep in mind. We must use distributed switches. And on those distributed switches, there's a lot of policies we can configure, but at a bare minimum, we need to ensure that we are using 1600 byte maximum transmission unit size. We've got to have room for our encapsulation, but we also need to make sure that our physical infrastructure is also ready to support a 1600 byte MTU as well, or it's not going to function. Let's just take a quick peek at the distributed switch configuration. We can see that this is using the 1600 byte MTU, and we could edit this right here if we needed to make a change. And remember, increasing your MTU is a pretty safe bet. It's like saying you're going to have a larger garage door. Doesn't mean you can't park a small car in it, but it means if you bring home a big truck, there's a place for it as well. On the physical network, another consideration is going to be our interconnection for routing services, especially with edge routing devices connecting to physical routing devices. It's quite likely that there will be some interconnection at some point of a dynamic routing protocol. Our edge devices can support both OSPF and BGP. They do not support, though, protocols like RIP or EIGRP, so if you're using those, you would actually need to change your routing infrastructure, at the very least doing some redistribution from that perimeter router in order to be able to interconnect with the NSX components. Oh, and one little side note about that dynamic routing support, if we're talking about a distributed router, it can only support OSPF or BGP, but if we're talking about an edge router, it can support OSPF and BGP if desired. Now, the last couple of things to think about in terms of brownfield deployments, again, we said that our cluster configuration may need to change as we think about compute versus management versus edge device clusters that we may never have had before. And in terms of networks, we need to remember that our network configuration must be based upon distributed switches rather than standard switches. So if we already had VMs that were connected to standard switches that were based upon VLANs, our eventual goal is to get virtual machines associated with distributed switches that are then functioning as logical switches that are associated with VXLANs. So it's typical in a brownfield deployment to start off by reproducing anything we've done with standard switches as distributed switches, and then carefully migrating the virtual machines from one platform to the other. So here we can see in the vSphere environment a standard and distributed switch have been created, and when we go to a VM and we actually head to the settings of that VM, we can head to the networking configuration. From the drop-down menu, we can see the available networks to select from, and we can actually see the difference in the iconography there between the standard VM port groups and the distributed port groups. Our VMs need to be on distributed port groups in order to work. With zero downtime requirements, that'll mean actually associating perhaps one of the NICs as a standard NIC and another NIC as a distributed NIC, rather than allowing those to be teamed together initially. And then once our virtual machines have been redistributed from one to the other, then we can reassociate that NIC as a part of the distributed switch teaming group. But that means that the distributed switch is really performing VLAN functionality, which means as a separate step, we'll need to come back in and apply the VXLAN encapsulation on top of that distributed switch and get the virtual machines to participate in that particular device. Well, my friend, as you can see, NSX is an invasive technology when it comes to vSphere. It is all over the place, and it's going to require us to really make sure that we have our ducks in a row, that we are ready with our environment. The physical infrastructure is in place, our distributed switch configuration is in place with the appropriate policies, we have the correct permissions to do the install, our IP scheme is in place, and we're ready to start the process of any migrations that might be necessary of devices into the right switch, the right port groups, on the right clusters. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.